Alright, today's lesson is on solving percent problems. By the end of this lesson, you should be able to solve a percent problem using a proportion. You should also be able to solve the rate of sales on a sales tax using a proportion. So what does the word percent mean? Well, the word percent is derived from two different Latin words. The word per means out of or of, and the word cent means 100. So the word percent means out of 100. So anytime you see that word per, it means of, and anytime you see that root word cent in a word, for example, century, it means 100. So the word century means 100 years. The word cent, when we talk about dollars and cents, the word cent actually means out of 100. 27 cents is 27 out of 100 because there are 100 cents in a dollar. So the percent proportion we're going to use to solve most percent problems, but they can also be set up and solved with a proportion. Remember, the percent will always be related to 100. So let's remind ourselves what a proportion is. All right? A proportion is just when we set two ratios equal to each other. That's just saying two fractions set equal to each other. So for example, 1/2 is equal to 2/4. Is a proportion because we have two fractions being set equal to each other. So it's setting them equal, the equal sign that makes it a proportion. So here's another example of a proportion. It's saying 4 out of 6 is equal to some number out of 3. All right, and it's that type of problem that we're going to solve today to be able to solve percent problems. So let's talk about solving proportions of review. All right, so take the fraction we had last time, the proportion we had last time. 4/6 is equal to some number over 3. Your first step is to set the cross products equal to each other. So in that case, that means multiply 6 times x, and then set that equal to 4 times 3, like I've done here. The next step is to simplify. So I'm going to simplify the 4 times 3, and that's just equal to 12. So all I did is multiply 4 times 3 to get 12. So now we have the statement, or the equation, 6x is equal to 12. Then finally, I can solve for x by dividing by the coefficient of x, in this case, the 6. So I divide both sides by 6, and we get that x is equal to 2. Now the percent proportion is simply is over of is equal to some percent over 100. So the percent is always over 100, because remember, percent does mean out of 100. Is going to be the number that's with the word is, and of is going to be the number that's with the word of. So when you see a percent problem, that will make more sense to you, because you'll see where it says is and of. The 100 is always on the bottom. So this type of proportion can be used when solving simple percent statements such as what is 10% of 100, or 10 is what percent of 100, or 100 is 10% of what number. So let's do an example. 50 is what percent of 230? Okay, so we're going to use our percent proportion, which is over of equals percent over 100. And I would write this down in your notes. All right, so I'm going to go start filling in. Remember, we automatically have the 100 on the bottom, so I can fill that in first before even I read the problem, really. But now I'm going to use the words in the problem themselves to fill in the other numbers and to figure out what we're trying to solve for. So when it says what percent, 50 is what percent of 230, it's the percent then. It's the percent that we're trying to figure out. So that's what I'm going to call our x, our variable. And then I'm going to go ahead and use the words is and of to determine what number should be where the is and what number should be where the of is. So notice 50 is. Since 50 is with the word is, where it says is in this proportion, I'm going to put the 50. And notice that the 230 is with the word of, so where the word of is in this proportion, I'm going to put 230. Now we have a proportion, just like we had on the previous slide, that we can solve by setting the cross products equal. So we're going to cross multiply to get our answer. So when you do that, you get the answer of 21.7391 and so on. Then I'm going to round that to 1 decimal place. And so I'm going to get that x is equal to 21.7%. So what does that mean in the context of this problem? Right, it means that 50 is 21.7%, or about 21.7% of 230. Okay, so what is 85% of 40? Okay, so remember, I start by writing down that percent proportion. Is over of equals some percent over 100. And then I try to decide where the numbers go next. Okay, so the first thing that jumps out at me is the 85, right? So the 100's already here, and 85 is a percent. In this case, we can see that it says 85%. So where the percent is, I'm going to plug in the number 85. Now I got to decide what goes with the is and what goes with the of. So in this case, I notice that what is, the is part is not given to us. They're asking, what is this number? Right? So that's where we're going to have our variable, our x. And then the number that's with the of is 40. So it's just a matter of putting the numbers in the right spot and then cross-multiplying and dividing to get your answer. So when we set our cross products equal and divide, we end up with the answer of x is equal to 34. So that means 34 is 85% of 40. So you can kind of think about that. Does that make sense? So the original question is, what is 85% of 40? Well, 100% of 40 is 40. We know that. 100% of any number is its own self. So if we're asking what 85% of 40 is, then I'm thinking it should be a little bit less than 40, but not too much so. And so 34 does make sense. Another way to think about it is if I cut 40 in half, that would be 50% of 40, right? That would be half of it. And half of 40 is 20. So again, this number, 85% of 40, should be larger than 20. And we know it's got to be less than 40, so it's somewhere in between there. So then reasonably, looking at my answer here, I'm thinking that the answer of 34 does in fact make sense. So 25% of what number is 400? Would you take a moment to pause the video and see if you can solve this one on your own? All right, so you should always start out with your percent proportion. Is over of equals 100% over 100. Then you got to decide what numbers to plug in where. Well, we can see that the 25 is with the percent sign, so where the percent sign is in this proportion is where I'm going to plug in the 25. Okay, easy enough. And then we got to decide where's the variable and what is, so what is the is and what is the of. Okay, well here we read that 25% of what number. So the of is with what number, so that kind of tells me that that's going to be the variable. We can see here that the is with the 400, so I'm going to go ahead and plug in 400 where the is in our equation. And of what numbers, that's what we're looking for. That's what we're trying to figure out. So where the of is, I'm going to put a variable, our variable x. And then as always, we cross-multiply to get the answer. So in this case, we end up with an answer of x is equal to 1600. That means that 25% of 1600 is 400. Because that's what our original question was asking. 25% of some number is 400. So that means this number's got to be larger than 400, right? And in fact, it's 4 times larger, just like there's 4 quarters in a dollar. 25 times 4 is 100. 400 times 4, 1600, makes sense. So how about this one? What is 175% of 80? Before we even set up the proportion, I want you to think about what kind of answer should you get. So what is 175% of 80? Should this number be larger than 80 or smaller than 80? Well, 100% of 80 is 80 itself. We talked about that earlier. So if I'm looking for something that's 175% of 80, it should be larger than 80. How about I take a guess? What's a reasonable estimate if I were to estimate what this number is in my head before I even set up the proportion and solve it? Well, if I were to double 80, that would mean find 200% of 80. I would get 160. So I'm not finding 200% though of 80. I'm finding 175% of 80. So I'm guessing this number is a little bit less than twice of 80. So it should be a little bit less than 160. So if I had a guess, even before I set this up, I'd say maybe it's 140 or something, somewhere around there, 130, 140. So let's go ahead and set up the percent equation to get an exact answer. And once again, is over of equals percent over 100, always over 100. You can plug that into your equation first without even thinking. Then we know that we're finding 175% of this number. So where the percent is our 175. The is what we're looking for. What is that number? So that tells me where the is, that's our variable. So where you see the what is, whatever what is next to, that's going to be the variable. And we're looking for 175% of 80. So where the of is, I'm going to plug in 80. And then as always, we cross multiply to get our answer. So then when we do that, we get that x is equal to 140. So 140 is 175% of 80. How about you pause the video and try to solve this one on your own? And then after you're done with that, find what percent of 256 is 64. Take a moment to pause the video to solve that problem. And then do what is 45% of 178. So those were the three example types that we solved. Go ahead and work them out on your own. Okay, so let's go through the first one. So I'm going to find out 19 is 25% of what number? So remember how we always start these. We want to do is over of is equal to some percent over 100. So write that down first, then start filling in your numbers. So we can see right here that 25 is a percent. So right where we have the percent here, we can write in 25. So we got 25 over 100. And we're setting that equal to is. So 19 is, and it's 19 is where the word is. So where the word is I'm going to plug in 19. And where the of is where the word what, or what number. So that tells me that that's where I'm going to put my x, or my variable. And then I can go ahead and now cross multiply to solve this proportion. So in this case, that I get that 25x is equal to 19 times 100. And then to get the x by itself, I would divide both sides by 25. So I'd have x is equal to 19 times 100, which is 1900, divided by 25. It's 100. So finally, when you can pull out a calculator, you can do this by hand. And you'll get that, in this case, 1900 divided by 25 is equal to 76. So notice that all these problems, they may have the x in a different place, but they're all solved by the same percent proportion. And once you have your proportion, we solve them by cross multiplying the exact same way every time. So once you have it set up, then you're going to get the right answer as long as you remember how to cross multiply and divide. So here we're going to say what percent of 256 is 64. So remember, we're saying what percent, so where the percent is this time in this problem, that's what we're looking for. That's the x. And look what is with the word is 64. So where this is I'm going to plug in 64. Where the of is, I'm going to plug in 256. And the percent is what we're looking for. So that's my variable x, and we always have it over 100. So in this case, we cross multiply and divide, and I get 256x is equal to 64 times 100, which is just 6,400, right? You just add the 2 zeros to the 64. And then you go ahead and divide both sides by the 256, and you get that 6,400 divided by 256 is equal to 25. So again, once I get my answer, just to make sure I set up the proportion correctly, I always like to go back and read the problem and ask myself if my answer makes sense. Like, is it in the ballpark of where the answer should be? So in this case, we have that. And I should technically write the word percent on here because 25 is a percent. What percent of 256 is 64? So remember, 100% of 256 would be 256 itself. Then if I cut 256 in half, that would be 50% of 256, and that would be 128. So I'm looking for a number that is half of that, because this number, we're looking for what percent of 256 is 64. So this number is less than 50%. And since 64 is half of 128, which is half of 256, our answer of 25% makes sense. How about what is 45% of 178? So once again, why don't you just go ahead and ask yourself, should this number be larger than 178 or less than 178? All right, this number should be less than 178. Remember, 100% of 178 would be 178. We're looking for 45% of 178. So about half, a little less than half of 178 is what I expect my answer to be. But let's get the exact answer by setting up our percent proportion. All right, so I'm going to use is over of equals percent over 100. So we can see that the 45 is actually with the percent sign. So where that percent sign is, I'm going to plug in 45. It's always over 100. And I'm going to set that equal to, well, we can see with the of is with the number 178. So in our equation here, where the of is, I plug in 178. And then what we're looking for is the is. So what is? So I plug in an x, our variable, where the word is. And so we can go ahead and set our cross products equal. So 100x is equal to 178 times 45. And then my last step here would be to divide both sides by the 100. So whatever 178 times 45 divided by 100 is the answer that we're looking for. So I'm going to go ahead and do that on my calculator. So I'm going to get that 178 times 45 turns out to be 8,010, and then I divide that by 100. So the answer we get is 80.1. And unless otherwise indicated, if you have a decimal that goes on forever and ever after the percent, unless otherwise indicated, go ahead and round it to one decimal place. So now let's talk about sales tax. We can use a very similar proportion to the one we were just using to solve problems involving sales tax. Okay? We still set up a proportion, but this time the proportion we set up is tax over the price is equal to the percent, again, over 100. So very similar to what we looked at before. And by tax, I'm talking about the tax of an item in dollars. And the price is the total price of the item in dollars, not including tax. Right? And then we can use this percent over 100 to find out what that percentage is. So for example, Fred bought a shirt for $12 and he paid 99 cents in sales tax. What is the sales tax rate where Fred bought his shirt? All right, well, I'm going to go ahead and use the proportion that we just talked about to set that up. So again, I would take a moment and write this proportion in your notes, this formula there. All right, so let's pick out the important pieces of information in this problem. So it tells us what the tax is, right? So where the tax is, I'm going to plug in the 99 cents because that's the 99-cent sales tax we have. Now the total price of the shirt we can read here is $12. So in that place, I plug in the $12. We're, in this case, looking for what the percentage of the sales tax is. So where that is, I plug in the X, and it's always over 100. And then you solve this problem exactly the same as we had been in the previous slides. We set the cross products equal and divide. So in this case, we get that the sales tax is 8.25, which means 8.25%. 8.25%. All right, so how about we set up another problem? So let's find the sales tax on a $350 PlayStation 4. We know that that is $31.92. So we want to know now what the sales tax is, the percentage rate. Okay, so we're asking, hey, what percent is that sales tax? All right, so we set up our proportion. And the tax in this case was $31.92, just all by itself. So that's where I'm plugging in for the tax here. All right, now the price of the PlayStation is $350. We're trying to figure out what the sales tax rate is, so that's where my X goes, and it's always over 100. And then we cross multiply and divide, just like we had before, and we get the answer 9.12. So the sales tax in this case is 9.12%. You also see how we could use this exact same proportion to solve problems where I was asking for maybe the original price of an item if you knew what the tax was and what the tax rate was. But in this case, we're just going to solve for the tax rate itself. So again, let's take a moment, pause the video, and solve this proportion using the numbers based on this problem. Okay, so the sales tax on a $640 computer at Best Buy is $48.75. So what is the tax rate? All right, so we know that the tax itself was $48.75. The total price of the computer was $640. We're trying to find what percent that is out of 100. So again, we set our cross products equal. Remember, we set 640 times x. We set that equal to 48.75 times 100. And then we divide by the coefficient of x to get 7.62. So the sales tax is 7.62%. Remember to go back into the announcements in your course, find asynchronous session 6 questions, and submit them.